America was going to lose this war. The problem is that when empires are in decline, this is just the way they behave. And there's just the historical record, it's pretty overwhelming in that when empires decline, they lash out against the world, they start these stupid wars they can't possibly win, they overextend themselves, and the collapse is terrible for the world. And America very much is an empire in decline. Look at things such as the collapse of the family. Look at things such as the collapse of the currency. Currency debasement in America is just a tremendous problem. The US dollar is no longer worth as much as it was like 10 years ago. The polarization in America, Congress just cannot function properly. The president has so much power nowadays because Congress has basically decided to just not do anything to avoid any political responsibility. And so it's destroying the checks and balance systems of the US Constitution. The economic depression in America is great. Young people feel as though there's absolutely no hope in the world. They're refusing to have families. They're refusing to invest in the future. They gamble all the time. And so America is really the end of empire at this point. And so what they do is they go and start wars in order to distract people's attentions, in order to prove to the world that they still have it. They're still the bully in the playground, and they can still beat up every other kid, even though they're old and they're weak and they're handicapped. And so, we talk about Iran, but look at what was happening before Iran, right? Trump kidnapped the president of Venezuela, which went against international law. Trump deployed his navy in the Caribbean and started to bomb drug boats, which is again against international law. Trump was threatening to annex Greenland. He was threatening to invade Canada. He was threatening to attack Mexico. Right now, he's embargoing Cuba. And people don't even recognize this is happening because there's so much going on in the world. But Cuba was dependent on Venezuela oil. That was its energy supply. And now that Venezuela has fallen to the Americans have embargoed Cuba, and so now people don't have access to electricity. And there are actually people who are starving in Cuba. So this is an empire in decline. It just lashes out against the world. It attacks everyone. And Iran is just the most current iteration of this anger and this hubris. But this hubris made the Americans underestimate the capacity of Iran. They went in thinking that once they decapitate the regime, then the government would fall. And what the Americans didn't recognize was the resilience and the resolve of the Iranian people. America right now has several disadvantages. The first major disadvantage is the lack of political will. And that just means the lack of a strategy, the lack of a purpose. It cannot unify the American people in order to make the sacrifice necessary to win this war. In fact, most Americans are against this war. Right before the war started, 70 to 80% of Americans voiced their disapproval of a possible war with Iran. Usually when a war starts, people will rally behind the flag, but not in this case. Most Americans are still against the war. So the first issue is the lack of political will. But if you look at the Iranians, they believe that this is a struggle of life and death. So they've set aside the political differences and they've committed to winning this war, okay? So that's the first factor, political will. The second factor is just manufacturing capacity. So these past 30, 40 years, America went from a manufacturing-based economy to a financial-based economy, and they export their manufacturing capacity to China. Now, when you fight a war, what really matters is your capacity to produce ammunition, to replenish your munitions, logistics. And America doesn't have the manufacturing capacity to fight a long war. In fact, what's happening already is that America is cannibalizing munitions from other parts of the world. So they are now transferring munitions from South Korea over to the Middle East, which is stupid to do because now you've basically opened more flanks, opened more vulnerabilities throughout the world. So manufacturing capacity is a very important factor. On the other hand, Iran uses drones and ballistic missiles. And we know that Iran is able to manufacture about 500 drones a day. And quite honestly, you only need to have 10 drones hit their targets in the Middle East every single day in order for the GCC to cry uncle, right? So manufacturing capacity is a very important factor as well. And the third factor is that America is hamstringed by a lot of political considerations. So because they lack political will, they do not want to take too many casualties, right? So Trump has said that 6 Americans have died in this war so far. There's just absolutely no way this is true. We are hearing rumors that there are a lot of casualties being flown to Germany to try to disguise the fact that in the Middle East, many Americans are dying. But this tells us that America has absolutely no appetite to sustain any casualties. If you refuse to have any casualties, how are you going to fight a war, right? On the other hand, the Iranians are very eschatological. They are very religious. They are Shia Muslim, and they're not afraid to die. In fact, they believe it is the highest honor to martyr yourself for the higher good. And the clear example of this is the Ayatollah Khamenei, who was killed on the first day of strikes. And he could have gone to Moscow and he could have hid his bunker, but instead he chose to go to his office and carry on with his life because he's 86 years old and he does not want to die afraid of the Americans. And so he set the example that is galvanizing the Iranian people. If you just look at some social media footage from Iran, the Iranian people are now extremely energetic, extremely galvanized, and they will fight this war to the bitter end. First of all, I don't think there's an off-ramp for this war. I think it's very hard to de-escalate. The idea that the Americans will just give up their petrodollar and the American bases and just go home is just absurd. That is not how empires behave. Also, Israel, because it wants to achieve the Greater Israel Project, is heavily invested in creating a regional conflagration to create as much havoc as possible so that they could destroy the region and then be the only one left standing. Okay, and so what Israel wants to do is drag everyone into the war, including Turkey, including Saudi Arabia, including basically the entire Middle East. And so during the first couple of days, there was reporting that an Iranian drone had struck a Saudi Aramco oil facility. And so Aramco closed down all its energy production. But then later reporting came out to reveal that actually the drone came from Lebanon. So it didn't come from the east, it came from the west, which meant Israel. Carlson on his TV show, on his show, said that he had received information from the Qataris that they had arrested 2 Mossad agents, and they suspected these Mossad agents of trying to sabotage the Qatar oil facilities in order to create a false flag. So the Israelis are heavily invested in trying to create as much conflict between the GCC and Iran as possible. And now there's talk of Turkey coming in as well. Recently, there was a drone attack from Iran against Azerbaijan. And Azerbaijan was very angry about this and even floated the possibility of sending in ground troops against Iran. But then it was later discovered that this was probably a false flag of the Israelis. So the Israelis are heavily interested in spreading this war as far as possible and creating as much destruction as possible. And they want this war to continue for as long as possible because they have nuclear weapons. So the Iranians are not going to hit them too hard. The Iranians are going to hit the GCC much harder. And so it's just, for the Israelis, they just have to endure, right? It's a war of attrition. And then once Saudi Arabia is destroyed, once the GCC is destroyed, then Israel will be the only power left standing. Okay, so that is Israel's intention. Other nations will eventually have to be drawn in as well. So one wild card is Pakistan. So during the 12-day war, Pakistan supported Iran. But after that, a few months after that, Saudi Arabia signed a mutual defense pact with Pakistan. So if Saudi Arabia is attacked, Pakistan must come to its aid. And we know that Pakistan has nuclear weapons. So it is very likely that at some point, Saudi Arabia will join this war on behalf of the Americans because the animosity between Saudi Arabia and Iran go way back. Iran is a theocracy. Saudi Arabia is a monarchy. And they see each other as heretical, okay, as against Islam. The Iranians hate Saudi Arabia because Saudi Arabia is the home of Mecca and Medina, the 2 holiest sites in the Islamic world. At the same time, they host a lot of American soldiers. These are infidels in the eyes of the Iranians. And so the Iranians are heavily interested in trying to topple the Saudi regime. And they're going to apply pressure to cause uprisings throughout the GCC. And I believe that at some point, the Saudi government will decide to enter this war. And if they enter this war, then Pakistan is obligated to enter this war as well. If the Americans were to launch a ground invasion, it would make sense to attack from multiple vectors. And one vector would be from Pakistan. Another vector, of course, would be from Iraq. The last vector would be from Azerbaijan. They would also try to seize the Strait of Hormuz as soon as possible in order to maintain global trade. So that in the short term, we can expect the entire Middle East to be engulfed in this war at some point. In the long term, eventually, the Southeast Asian economies will have to intervene. So South Korea and Japan are extremely reliant on oil from the Strait of Hormuz. In fact, they would basically starve to death if it were not from this oil from the Strait of Hormuz. But there's a wild card, and that's North Korea. So if you're North Korea and you are analyzing the situation, you recognize that now's the perfect opportunity to threaten South Korea because Americans are distracted in the Middle East, and the South Koreans don't have access to the oil they need to protect themselves against the North Koreans. So just threaten South Korea, and then the Americans are forced to divert their attention back to Southeast Asia, and Japan is forced to come into this conflict as well. And the North Koreans aren't doing this to start a war. That'd be suicidal. They're doing this to extort as much as possible from South Korea and Japan. And so I expect that to happen as well. The Western Hemisphere will not be quiet this time because while this is happening, Trump is still intent on toppling the Cuban government, okay? So it's possible 2 weeks from now, while this war is still raging, Trump attacks Cuba or Mexico or Colombia. It is complete insanity. But this is, again, unfortunately, this is the way an empire behaves as it declines. And in this war, there are 3 major questions that will determine the outcome of this war, as well as the world afterwards. Okay, and these 3 questions are, number 1, will the US launch a ground invasion? So right now, the United States and Israel are primarily focused on an air war, striking Iran from a distance. In the past, we would call this siege warfare. And as long as it remains an air war, the United States can choose to de-escalate and withdraw from the Middle East. They would lose this war, but the loss would not be catastrophic. Whereas if they choose to launch a ground invasion, it would escalate very quickly and they would be trapped in Iran for the next 5 to 10 years. It would be a catastrophe whether or not they win or lose. Because in order to fight a ground war, the United States would have to institute a national draft where a young man as young as 18 would be forced to join the army and be sent to fight in Iran, okay? So that's the first big question for us. Will the United States send in ground troops? And remember, there's the idea of mission creep, where maybe in the beginning you're like, I'll send out 1,000 troops to do a small mission. But then it doesn't go well, so you send in 2,000, okay? It slowly creeps up. It's what we call mission creep. And that's how the United States embroiled itself in Vietnam. All right, so that's the first big question. Second big question is, will nukes be used? There's a lot of concern online that Israel is preparing a nuclear strike on Iran because they really don't like how the war is going, and they want to reclaim the initiative. Nukes are a taboo in geopolitics. The Americans used them at the end of World War II, and no one's used them ever since. If Israel were to use tactical nuclear weapons, they would break this universal taboo, and we might find ourselves in a nuclear apocalypse, okay? So that's a great concern that everyone has right now. And the third question is the Al-Aqsa Mosque. This is the third holiest site in the Islamic world. There's Mecca, there's Medina, and there's the Al-Aqsa Mosque. The Muslims believe that it is from the Al-Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem where Muhammad ascended to heaven. And the Jews believe that the Al-Aqsa Mosque sits on the site of their temple, which is the house of God. So religious Jews, extremists, want to destroy the Al-Aqsa Mosque to rebuild the third temple. And if the religious Jews, the extremists, destroy the Al-Aqsa Mosque, then the 2 billion Muslims in this world would be religiously obligated to go to war against Israel, okay? So these are the three big questions that will determine how this war will determine the future of the world. Okay, so in this class, I teach you game theory to make predictions about the future. So right now, I'm gonna make 3 predictions, and then I will show you my analysis as to how I make these predictions, okay? Now, what's important to understand is that these are only my guesses based on my analysis. And whether or not they turn out to be correct will determine the validity of my analysis. I don't have inside information. I don't know more than you do, okay? I'm just working out of public knowledge and doing game theory analysis. So according to game theory, this is yes. The United States will send in ground troops. According to game theory, this is no. And number 3 is yes, okay? So what I'm gonna do is spend the next 2 classes explaining to you my game theory analysis as to how I come to these conclusions. And we can watch how world events unfold. Now, I want you to understand something, which is that for my theory to be valid, for my analysis to be valid, I have to be correct on all 3, okay? If I miss one, then all my theory is wrong. I know there's a lot of concern from around the world that nukes will be used. And I'm 100% confident that nukes will not be used at this time in this war. And if I'm wrong, I apologize to the world, okay? But at the same time, we'll all be dead anyway, so it doesn't really matter, all right? Okay, all right, so let me explain my analysis, okay? So remember, today, what I'm gonna do is do number 1 and number 2, explain to you why Israel will not use nuclear weapons and why there will be a ground invasion. And then next class, I'll explain number 3 to you, okay? That's a plan for this week. All right, so to understand what's going on, I need to teach some basic geopolitical theory, okay? So in military affairs, in geopolitics, there's a concept called escalation ladder, okay? And the dominant theory is that whoever has escalation dominance has the most advantage. Okay, so what this means is, let's just say you and I get in a fight, okay? I have a knife, you have a gun. Well, a gun is more dominant than a knife. Therefore, you have a greater advantage over me, and therefore you should win, in theory, okay? And applied to this war in the Middle East, Israel and the United States have escalation dominance because they have nuclear weapons, and Iran doesn't. Therefore, the United States and Israel have a huge advantage over Iran, okay? But what I will show you today is that this theory is incorrect. It actually doesn't work that way, right? So let's start off with a very simple example. Let's just say that 2 people get into a fight, okay? A and B. And how the escalation ladder will work is that maybe A and B run into each other, okay? And then A says, hey man, say sorry. And then B is like, it's not my fault, you say sorry, okay? So there's a conflict, and it's usually a very small conflict. No one knows why, and no one knows who's at fault, okay? So they start cursing each other, okay? So the first step is a conflict. Second step is they start cursing each other, right? Screw you, screw you. And then they might start pushing each other, right? Push, push. And then they hit each other, okay? Punch, punch. And then they start the fight, and then one pulls out a knife, and the other pulls out a gun, all right? And then B shoots dead, hey, fight over, right? Okay, so there are certain things that we need to keep in mind about this example. First of all, the fight is not contained in itself, okay? You cannot perceive this game as just one between A and B, who's physically stronger. There are other players involved as well. Okay, so for example, there are spectators or friends. There's a crowd watching you, okay? This is important because there's also the police, right? Eventually the police will come, the government, and they'll ask people, hey, what happened, man? Whose fault was it, right? And also, for people who are religious, there's also God, right? If you die, you have to go up to God, heaven, and God's gonna ask you, hey man, how did you die?
So you have to explain how you died, all right? So in other words, in this escalation ladder, there's 3 factors that you have to consider that drive people up this escalation ladder. These 3 factors are, of course, emotions. Second is power. And the third is reason or logic, okay? And what drives people up is adrenaline. In other words, it is impossible to skip the escalation ladder, right? You don't go from like, hey, screw you, to like the guy pulling out a gun and shooting you, okay? You have to go step by step by step because adrenaline is rushing in your system. And this adrenaline, it's making you more angry, but it's also making you stronger and more resolved. And it's also telling you how to fight this battle, okay? And the thing to remember about this is really important, is that it's not about how fast you climb up the escalation ladder. Okay? If you get too angry and you overreact, then you are at fault, right? What you want to do is climb it up strategically. And that means you have to remain calm and controlled. Because if you remain calm and controlled, you have 3 advantages over your opponent. The first is focus. Second is clarity. And the third is focus. You're clear and resolve, okay? Resolve, okay? What this means is that you know what you're doing, you have a strategy, you're clear about how to achieve your strategy and your goal, and you are determined to achieve it, okay? But in order to have all 3, you have to remain calm, and therefore you need to control yourself as you climb up this escalation ladder. Because remember, it's just not about being your opponent, it's about justifying yourself to your friends, to the police, and to God as well. Because you might hit that person, he might go to hospital, and you've won the fight, but then you go to prison for 10 years, in which case you've lost the fight. The main idea I want you to remember is this, and this is a law of escalation, and this is a very important idea in my game theory model. Control is more important than dominance. Control is more important than dominance. Why? Because control is the idea of calibration. Calibration means that you time or you structure or you strategize your response in a way that helps you achieve your strategic objective. Okay? You're not just throwing punches, you're throwing a punch in a certain way that allows you to defend yourself, that strikes fear in the opponent, and also allows you to seem as the good guy among spectators. Okay? And then when the police come, you can justify why you threw that punch in a certain way to the police so that you don't go to jail. Okay? Alright, so another way of saying this is that calibration is ultimately about strategic flexibility. And the idea of strategic flexibility is, in a fight, the person who has the most options, the person who has the most flexible strategy will usually win the fight. Okay? This is a law of escalation. And I'll explain to you how this applies to the US-Iran war.